Do you know what haunts me most to this day? It wasn't the silence he left me with, nor the lies I discovered too late, not even the betrayal. What never left my mind was that last look, those eyes, already weak, unhurried, but filled with a regret that needed no words. It was as if, there, at the end of everything, he finally understood what he'd lost. And the cruelest part of it all? It was that it was already too late. Have you ever felt that way? As if someone only saw you when there was nothing left to do? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover now may surprise you. For many years, I remained silent. I pretended I didn't see, I didn't feel, I didn't know. I endured everything quietly, believing that enduring was the same as being strong. But no one warned me that silence also bleeds, that each day without an answer was a part of me being erased, little by little. And he continued living as if nothing was happening, as if the love he once promised had evaporated without leaving a mark. But it did, and how it did. It left a scar, it left questions, and it left a story that still lives inside me, waiting to be told. This isn't just another story of betrayal. It's a story of life, of emotional overcoming, of looking into the eyes of the one who destroyed you and still choosing not to break inside. Because what no one sees is that, before reaching that final look, there was a whole path of absence, of broken promises and of small gestures that, added up, weighed a ton. It was a kind of abandonment that didn't slam the door. It stayed, but it was gone inside, and that sometimes hurts even more. I remember well the day I realized his love was no longer mine. It wasn't because he said so. It was because he stopped looking at me the way he used to. The sparkle in his eyes changes when the truth begins to sink in. And yet, I stayed. I stayed out of love, out of fear, out of habit, out of faith. I thought one day he would see me again as he did in the beginning, as the woman he chose, whom he admired, whom he claimed to love. But the days turned into months, and the months turned into years, and I became just a shadow within our own story. And when life decided to end, not for me nor for him, but for something greater, I was there, at the edge of the bed, holding the hand of the one who hurt me. And that's where it all happened. He looked at me as if seeing for the first time, as if finally seeing the woman who had always been there, strong, faithful, present. His gaze, in that moment, carried guilt, pain, and a truth he never knew how to say, that he regretted it, that maybe I had loved, yes, but too late, and that the woman he hurt the most was the only one who stayed until the end. That's why this story needs to be told, because there are so many people out there experiencing the same thing, being invisible in their own homes, being hurt in silence, waiting for a gaze that may never come. But what if it does? What if, when it's time to leave, the other person finally sees what they've lost? What do we do with this kind of truth? Have you ever been there? Sometimes the greatest act of repentance doesn't come with words. It comes in a look, in a sigh, in a silence that says more than any excuse. And that's why that moment has never left me. Because it was there that I understood so much. That love can fail, that people make mistakes, but the dignity of those who endure, even without applause, even without recognition, no one can take away. Not time, not pain, not death. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what happened after that look says much more about me than it does about him. And maybe that's what you need to hear today. Comment. That makes sense to me. And when I say that look said it all, it's because in that moment, I saw the weight of a lifetime reflected in his eyes. There was no more time, no excuse, no gesture that could erase everything that had already been lived or left undone. But there was no anger in me either. I had understanding. I had a gentle pain, the kind that doesn't scream, but shapes us from within. And if you're listening to this now and felt something deep inside, maybe it's because this story also speaks to something within you. That's why I open my heart here, because every story I tell isn't just mine. It's ours. They're stories of people who felt too much, kept quiet too much, waited too long. And I know that when we share, we create a place where others can also recognize themselves, heal, or at least feel less alone. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what resonated with you most. Sometimes, a single sentence you write can resonate with someone else who's going through something similar. Your participation is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content that goes beyond entertainment. It's life lived with soul and truth. And if you want to continue this journey with me, listening to stories that touch deeply, that heal and transform, subscribe to the channel. This shows that this space matters, that this kind of narrative has value. Oh, and leave your like too, not for the number, but for the bond it creates between us. It's a small gesture that goes a long way in keeping this space alive and pulsating. Now, let me tell you what happened after that day, because that's when my true story started to turn inside out. And maybe that's what you need to hear right now. At first, it was like one of those good dreams where you wake up smiling and try to go back to sleep, just to continue. He arrived with simple flowers, but they seemed the most beautiful in the world because they came with a smile that made me believe. You know that phase when any gesture, no matter how small, carries an enormous weight of affection? It was like that. Every word he said seemed designed to fit me, to calm me, to make me feel like someone finally saw who I truly was. It was as if, after so much silence and loneliness, someone had finally looked at me with presence. I believed his eyes, even more than his words, because some people lie beautifully with their mouths, but their eyes betray. And his, in the beginning, held a promise, a kind of security I'd never experienced before. It was that warmth of home I'd only felt as a child, before everything fell apart. When he called me my haven, I believed him. When he said he'd never leave me alone, I closed my eyes and imagined a whole life built by his side. And it wasn't a foolish illusion, no. It was a dream nourished every day by gestures, by affection, by an attention that made me blossom. But there's a thing about dreams. Sometimes they start to fade silently, and we only notice when we're already barefoot on the cold ground of reality. And I didn't realize when that tender look began to lose its light. Maybe it was one morning, when he passed me by without seeing me. Or maybe it was during a conversation where he was there, but with his soul elsewhere. Little things we pretend not to notice because we want to believe. Because you'd rather keep the pretty plot than face the real thing. And that's exactly when my mindset began to transform, without me even realizing it. It was during this period that the hidden truth began to reveal itself, not as a scandal, but as an absence. The absence of care, of attention, of presence. And you know, when the other person stops seeing you, that's when we have to decide whether to keep insisting or start seeing each other again. Because the pain of silent abandonment can be more cutting than any scream. It's the pain of feeling invisible within a relationship that was once a shelter. That's when my journey of revelations began, albeit silently, discreetly. I was no longer the woman with the notes left on the door. Now, I was the woman who sat alone at the table, staring at the empty space on the other side and trying to understand what had changed. And the strangest thing is that no one from the outside saw it. Everyone still said we were an admirable couple. This made me think about how many other stories exist out there, full of behind-the-scenes details that no one imagines. How many women walk down the street with a smile on their face, but with their souls crying out for help? Hidden pain is one of the hardest to bear, because we have no one to share it with. It was at this point in my life that I began to understand that the truth often lies in what is unsaid, in the averted glances, the curt answers, the touch that failed to happen. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it was in that gap between what I felt and what he pretended that something inside me began to change. Not explosively, not like a cry of revolt, but like a slow, silent, steady awakening. It was the seed of my own strength beginning to germinate, even in cracked soil. And that, my dear, changes everything. Right there, I'm on this journey too. I read every word with an open heart. I remember those first delays like someone clinging to an excuse that still seems possible. The traffic was bad. The boss asked me to stay a little longer. I forgot my keys. I went to get them. Small, justifiable things, but they began to repeat themselves like a pattern my heart had already recognized, even when my head refused to accept it. I'd look at the clock and tell myself, he'll be here soon. Maybe he's just tired. And when he finally arrived, with that distant look in his eyes, I'd smile anyway, as if my smile could bring him back. And therein lies the most painful truth. Sometimes we lie to ourselves so carefully, we almost believe it. Because it's easier to pretend everything is normal than to admit it's slipping through our fingers. I pretended not to see the glances that no longer sought me, the silent dinners, the hurried, soulless kiss, the absence disguised as fatigue. It was as if he were there, but the soul, the interest, the truth, everything was already gone. But even so, I kept trying to maintain the same old scene. I laid the best tablecloth on the table. I made his favorite dish. I dressed the way he liked, and I waited. I hoped that at some point the man who had enchanted me would return, that look of affection and admiration would reappear amidst that icy routine. But it never did, and every attempt I made, every gesture of affection, seemed lost in the air, like words spoken in an empty room. What no one sees is that this denial comes at a high cost. We begin to forget ourselves too. We slowly fade away, hoping to keep the other person alive. And it's at this point that many people lose their way. Because loving someone who no longer sees you is like screaming into a deep well, hoping for an echo. And when that echo doesn't come, we grow accustomed to silence, but a silence that hurts, that weighs heavily. Deep down, I knew something was wrong. But hope? Oh, hope is a beautiful and dangerous thing. It makes us believe that if we just try a little harder, if we're kinder, more present, more patient, everything can go back to the way it was. But the hidden truth is that sometimes it's not up to us. Sometimes the other person has already made their choices long before we realize it, and we're left there, holding the pieces of a story that's no longer told. This phase was marked by a series of silent decisions. I chose not to question too much, not to ask where he was, not to insist on the I love yous that went unanswered. And that's when my own transformation began, even if unnamed at the time. Because pain slowly shows us what needs healing, and even without knowing it, I was already being shaped by his absence. I was already learning to sustain myself in my own presence. There was one particular night when I understood everything without needing an explanation. He arrived late, his gaze even more distant, and I asked, "Is everything okay?" The answer came automatically. "Just tired." But in that moment, the way he avoided my gaze told me everything words couldn't. It was as if my heart had translated a language his mouth refused to speak. And then I realized he was already gone. Only his body remained out of politeness, out of cowardice, or out of habit. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because it was precisely at this point that my mindset began to shift. Not aggressively, nor like someone who decides to turn the tables in anger, but like someone who calmly realizes that they too deserve presence. They deserve to be seen. They deserve love that stays, not that hides. And understanding this was the first step to regaining my strength, not by shouting, but silently, in my own time. Comment: that makes sense to me. I want to know how many others have experienced this kind of disguised silence. The truth didn't come as a whisper. It came like a punch, the kind that knocks the breath out of your soul. I'd already felt it somehow. We always feel it, even if we pretend not to. But feeling and knowing, they're very different things. Knowing is when the illusion finally shatters, when the curtain falls, when everything you've tried so hard to hold on to crumbles before your eyes, without asking permission, without preparing you. Discovering he had someone else was like falling from a very high place where I'd placed myself without realizing it. And it wasn't just the betrayal of my body that destroyed me. What hurt most was realizing he'd shared with someone else everything I'd believed was ours. The conversations he no longer had with me, the laughter he'd saved for her, the time he said he no longer had, but did. It just wasn't for me. There, I didn't cry out of anger. I cried out of shame, of feeling ridiculous for having believed every excuse, for having kept quiet for so long, trying to be strong, for having molded myself to fit into a space already occupied by someone else. And even worse, I cried because I realized he didn't even seem remorseful. It was as if he'd already made up his mind long ago. And I was just someone he didn't have the courage to tell that the role had changed. This revelation brutally confronted me, because the betrayal didn't just make me question him. It made me question everything: my trust, my worth, my ability to read the signs. And that's where a silent pain comes in, but one so familiar to so many women, the feeling of failure, that something was missing, that it wasn't enough. And this thought, even if it's a lie, sticks with a power that's hard to explain. But I remember that, on that night when everything came to light, I didn't scream. I didn't break anything. I didn't make a fuss. I sat there, staring into the empty kitchen, feeling as if time had stopped. And inside, an avalanche of memories, questions, images, and a cold feeling in my chest that wouldn't go away. It's strange how, in those moments, we can feel completely alone, even in our own home. I felt small, rejected, as if I'd been completely cast aside, as if our years together had meant nothing. And for a moment, my mind began to compare, trying to understand who she was, what she had that I didn't, what clothes she wore, what kind of conversations she had. It gnawed at me, until something inside me screamed louder, "You are not what they made of you." And that sentence became a turning point, because the betrayal, despite having dismantled me, also revealed a hidden truth, that I had been abandoning myself for a long time before he did this to me. I stopped listening to myself, caring for myself, respecting myself. I tried so hard to be what he needed. I forgot to remain who I was. And seeing this, as painful as it was, also freed me. From that day on, I understood that I needed to make decisions, not for him, but for myself, for the woman who existed before that relationship, for the woman who deserved love without hidden wounds, for the woman who, even in pieces, still had the strength to pick up what was left and start over. And it was this awakening that changed everything. The pain was still there, but now, alongside it, something new was growing: dignity. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the humiliation that betrayal brings is not the end. It is often the beginning of a journey of reconnection with one's soul, a journey that transforms, that reveals hidden strengths, and that shows, even through tears, that those who have themselves are never completely alone. Write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." I want to see who is walking with an open heart, even after the fall. And then came the hardest decision I've ever made: silence. Not out of cowardice, as many might think, but because at that moment, I didn't even have the strength to fight. You know when the pain is so deep that even raising your voice seems like an impossible effort? That's how I felt: silent, empty, almost invisible. And choosing not to confront immediately wasn't a strategy. It was an attempt at survival. It wasn't just the fear of exposing the truth. It was the fear of what would come next, of judgment, of exposure, of questions I wasn't yet ready to answer, not even for myself. I felt paralyzed, as if life were passing by outside, and I was watching from inside thick glass, where no one could hear me. Shame weighed heavily, too. The shame of having been betrayed, yes, but even more so, the shame of having kept quiet, of pretending every day that everything was fine, of continuing to smile at family gatherings, doing laundry, putting food on the table, as if the world hadn't fallen apart inside. And I continued like that for weeks, then months, swallowing my tears into my pillow, donning invisible armor to face the day. And every time he came home pretending to be normal, something inside me died a little more. But I didn't speak. I didn't cry in front of anyone, not even myself, because crying would be admitting it was real. And I wasn't ready for that yet. The hardest thing of all was feeling alone, even surrounded by people, because on the outside, the house continued with its sounds, its smells, its commitments. But on the inside, I was just an echo. And that's when I began to realize how treacherous silence is. Sometimes it protects, other times it suffocates. And in my case, it began to shape me, to transform me into someone who was no longer me. I no longer spoke of my desires. I didn't make plans. I didn't smile with my heart. I just existed. And existing like this, without shine, is like walking aimlessly. But the scariest thing was noticing how, over time, even suffering began to feel comfortable, as if I had grown accustomed to living in the dark. Silence was no longer just a choice. It was my new way of being in the world. But in all this silence, I also began to hear something I'd previously ignored: my own breathing, my own thoughts. I began to hear what I truly wanted, and most importantly, what I no longer wanted to accept, because silence, when we let it, reveals hidden truths. It sheds light on forgotten corners of the soul. It showed me old fears, wounds that never quite healed, needs I'd masked with excessive surrender. That's when I understood the true impact of that silence. It was giving me clarity about my dignity, about the kind of love I deserved, about the mindset I needed to rebuild within myself. And little by little, I began to listen to myself again, to hear the small inner revolts, the ones that say, "You're worth more than this. You weren't made to live in obscurity. You don't need to beg for crumbs of love." This transformation happened without fanfare, without an audience, without promises. Just me, rethinking decisions, reclaiming values, charting, in the dark, a new path. I didn't yet know what would come next, but I was already a different woman. A woman who, even in silence, was rebuilding herself. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because there's something incredibly powerful that happens when we stop waiting for an apology that may never come and start healing the wound ourselves. When we realize that, even without yelling, even without confrontation, we can find our strength again. But before we continue, tell me something in the comments. Write, "Silence also shaped me," if this part of the story spoke to you. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it was precisely that day, at the exact moment he left, that I understood the weight a look can carry. It wasn't a goodbye with pretty words, nor a speech filled with explicit regret. It was just an instant, a second frozen in time. But his eyes said it all, everything that had been bottled up for years, everything he never had the courage to admit out loud. I remember the light of that late afternoon. The room was so quiet. We didn't talk much anymore, but that day there was a different silence, heavier, denser. I could feel something changing, even without anyone saying anything. He was more fragile, not just his body. His pride seemed smaller too. And it was in that space, between his shallow breathing and my desire to scream everything I'd always held back, that his eyes met mine. It was a long, direct look, but without the strength for words, a look that trembled inside. And I felt it. I felt the regret. I felt his pain. It wasn't physical pain. It was the weight of what he failed to do, of what he didn't have the courage to build with me. It was as if he were saying, "I've seen everything you've done for me. I know what I've done to you. I just couldn't be who you deserved." And that disarmed me, because until then, I'd been hard, closed off, protected by the anger I'd so carefully cultivated. I thought that when he faced the end, I wouldn't feel anything, that I'd stand there, cold, reminding him of every wound. But when I saw that look, it dismantled me, because I realized that, despite everything, I still cared. Not about him, maybe, but about me, about the woman I was, about the woman I'd become. The emotional impact of that moment was profound. It was like a movie playing before my eyes. The days I waited for him to come home early for dinner, the birthdays he forgot, the empty apologies, the hugs that only came when his world was falling apart, and also the times I smiled even though I didn't want to, just to keep the home together. It was all there, in that last look, soundless, but full of meaning. You know, sometimes life doesn't give us clear explanations. Sometimes it reveals everything in a gesture, a detail, an expression. And that man's hidden truth, the one he always hid behind jokes, silence, or disdain, came to the surface there. He regretted it. I saw it. He didn't need to say it. His eyes were already screaming. But it was too late. Not for me. I was already in a different place emotionally. I no longer carried that need for repair. I no longer wanted him to stay. I wanted peace. And strangely enough, in that moment, I had it. It was as if that last look, filled with guilt, gave me something back. As if it said, "You won." I won not out of pride, nor revenge, but because I resisted, because I kept standing when everything was pushing me to the ground, because I found meaning in my own existence, even when he tried to diminish me. The truth is, he left with a heavy heart, and I was left with a light soul. That emotional shift changed everything about me. My perspective changed too. The way I saw myself, the way I saw others, how I began to more carefully choose who I let into my world. And today, when I speak of this, I don't speak with pain. I speak with awareness, because that scene was a turning point. He left, but I stayed, and I remained whole. And as contradictory as it may seem, that difficult moment brought clarity. It was a silent revelation, yes, but as powerful as a scream. He never had the courage to say he regretted it, but his body said it, his gaze said it, and it was enough. Not to start over with him, but to continue without him, with dignity, with freedom, with my entire truth. Comment below. That look said it all, if you've ever experienced something like that, or if that part touched your heart. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because rebuilding your life isn't a sudden snap, nor a decision we make overnight. It's a slow, often lonely process, full of stumbles and small victories that almost no one sees. After that last glance, after that silent farewell filled with regret, I stood there, frozen inside. My body continued. The days passed, but inside, it was as if everything had frozen. But I knew, either I moved or it would consume me completely. It wasn't easy. There were days when I woke up and felt like doing nothing. The silence in the house weighed heavily. Memories pounded against the walls, and it seemed like even the floor I walked on reminded me of unfulfilled promises. But the pain, over time, changed color. It stopped being an open wound and became a scar I regarded with respect, because each bruised piece told the story of a woman who resisted, who survived, who rebuilt herself, even without anyone applauding. I started with the small things, organizing the closets, throwing out what no longer made sense. And look, it wasn't just cleaning the house, it was an internal cleansing. It was as if each object I removed also helped me remove the weights that were no longer mine. And it was in this simple, almost insignificant gesture that the transformation began to happen. There was no magic, no visible miracle. It was faith, a faith I didn't even know I had. I started talking to myself more, walking, writing down what I felt, cooking more carefully just for myself. And there, among the pots and pans and notebooks, I found myself again. Not the woman he left behind, but the one who had always been there and who just needed space to blossom. This part of the journey was silent. There was no stage. He didn't get a pat on the back, but it had an impact, because every step I took was mine. Every decision, every new limit, every no I previously couldn't say, now came with both firmness and lightness. The hidden truth of everything I experienced is that I didn't need anyone to validate me. And understanding this was liberating. The loneliness that once frightened me became my ally, and with it, I found my truth. I discovered that I wasn't weak for being betrayed, nor stupid for having believed. I was human, and now, more than ever, I'm aware of my strength. The behind the scenes of this process was marked by tears, yes, but also by powerful decisions. I decided to forgive, not for him, but for myself, because carrying resentment kept me trapped in the past, and I wanted to move on. I wanted to give myself the chance at a bright, true future, where my story wouldn't be defined by who hurt me, but by who I chose to be after the wound. The mindset changed. The silent woman gave way to a woman who listens to herself, who respects herself, who knows the value of being at peace with her own conscience. The pain that was once a prison became an impulse, and I moved on, with small but purposeful steps. Grief became learning, abandonment became fuel, and shame gave way to dignity. Today, when I look back, I don't just see suffering. I see a journey of reconstruction where each broken piece found a new place within me. And the most beautiful thing is that, in this new version of my life, I didn't need to pretend. I didn't need to mold myself to fit anyone's expectations. I simply was, calmly, with faith, with truth. And so, I became the woman you're meeting now. A woman who no longer needs to shout to be heard, who learned to listen to her own soul, who doesn't forget what she's been through, but also doesn't dwell on what hurt. Because today I know, my story didn't end with a look of regret. It began again from that moment on. Write down, I'm on this journey too, if this passage spoke to you in any way. Because sometimes, all we need is to remember that we're not alone in this rebuilding. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's something no one tells you about time. It doesn't erase everything, but it transforms almost everything. I thought that, after everything I'd been through, the past was behind me, that the door had been slammed shut, and all that was left now was to walk on without looking back. But that's not how life works. Sometimes when we least expect it, it comes back. And it doesn't come back screaming, no. Sometimes it comes back like a letter left in the mailbox, or like a familiar voice crossing the street and calling out a name you'd lost track of. In my case, it was a memory that arrived unexpectedly, a face from the past, one of those you think you'll never cross paths with again. It was someone from his family. He wasn't coming to ask for anything, He was coming to tell. He was coming to share a story that, until then, I only half knew. And that's when I understood that my transformation had gone far beyond what I'd imagined. Because, faced with that person, faced with that reopened past, I didn't tremble. I didn't cry. I didn't shrink. I listened, calmly, with serenity, like someone who looks head-on at what once hurt and now only teaches. The hidden truth behind that reunion was clear. What once shook me no longer defines me. I was no longer the deceived, betrayed, silenced woman. I was the woman who survived the pain and built a peace so firm that not even the arrival of the past could unsettle it. It was at that moment that I realized the strength of my journey, not because I'd forgotten everything, but because even remembering it, I chose not to relive the pain. I chose to keep my mindset aligned with the woman I'd become, not the one I was forced to be. That decision changes everything, because when we grow internally, the impact of what comes from outside diminishes. That conversation, which years ago would have knocked me off my feet, now only confirmed that time is right. It doesn't give back what we've lost, but it delivers what we need to move on. And what I received there was clarity, a clarity so great that, for a moment, I even became emotional, not with sadness, but with gratitude, for having resisted, for having kept going even when everything seemed to be pulling me back. The behind the scenes of this transformation is silent, yet profound. There was no audience, no witnesses. It happened in the dark, deep within. And perhaps that's why it's so true. Because when we change inside, the world feels it, even without us needing to explain it. That woman from the past, who believed love meant suffering in silence, no longer exists. In her place lives a woman who knows her worth and is no longer afraid to face her memories. And do you know what was most powerful about this reunion? It was realizing that the pain didn't harden me. It shaped me, but it didn't close me off. I'm still open to love, to conversation, to listening. Only now, with filters, with boundaries, with emotional maturity. I heard everything he, even from afar, even no longer here, left unfinished. I heard it through the words of those who came in his name. And instead of losing myself in it, I found myself even more. It was then that I understood. The past doesn't come back to hold us back, but to show us how much we've grown. And I grew. I grew so much that when I found myself faced with that echo of pain, I didn't feel fear. I felt peace, a peace that comes from within and that no one can take away. Because it's not about what they did to me, but about what I did with what they did. Write in the comments, I'm on this journey too, if you've ever felt the past knocking on your door. But this time, you found a stronger, more lucid, more whole version of yourself to open up to. Because that's what life is, a sequence of encounters, goodbyes, and reunions. But the most important thing is who we become in the midst of it all. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because some looks say more than 1,000 apologies, and that last look of his, it stayed with me. Not because of what he said, because he didn't say it, but because of what he tried to hide. I saw there, in those final seconds, everything he never had the courage to verbalize. I saw the acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused, the regret for the words left unsaid, the silence filled with regret. It was as if, for the first time, he saw the whole woman who had always been before him, but too late. You know, I spent years trying to understand where I lost myself in that story. Whether it was when I ignored the signs, when I kept quiet, or when I accepted crumbs thinking they were love. But in that moment, looking into his eyes and feeling that weight coming from the other side, I realized that the one who got lost there wasn't me. I was pushed to the side, yes. I was diminished, silenced, forgotten. But the one who got lost was him, because he never had the courage to live truthfully. He never had the courage to love maturely. And now, without being able to say a word, that look gave me everything. His fear, his guilt, his loneliness, and his remorse. And the strangest thing is that I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel like demanding anything. Because in that moment, what dominated me most was a new serenity. As if finally everything had made sense. It was as if God were saying there, see? You didn't need any more explanations. You just needed to see with the eyes of your soul. And I saw. I saw who I was, who I had become, and everything I had endured. And it was beautiful, you know, because recognizing your own strength without having to prove anything to anyone is liberating. The hidden truth behind that scene wasn't about him. It was about me. It was about how much I'd grown, even while being diminished, about how much I'd rebuilt myself, even while being rejected, and about how forgiveness, when it comes from the soul, doesn't need to be spoken. It just happens. I forgave. Not because he asked, but because I deserved that lightness. I deserved to move on without carrying the debris of a story that no longer fit me. And here comes one of the greatest revelations of this journey. Self-worth isn't shouting. It's silence that doesn't bend. It's being whole even after being shattered. It's knowing that your dignity doesn't depend on others' eyes. That look in his eyes taught me this. It showed me that, even when we're snuffed out by others, the inner light doesn't fade. It just stays still until the right time to shine again. And my time has come, at the right time, with the right clarity, with the strength that only those who have fallen and risen truly know. This lesson remains with me to this day, because emotional wisdom isn't born from the absence of pain. It blossoms when we refuse to be defined by it. The woman who remained silent years ago isn't the same woman who walks with her head held high today. Today I understand that I didn't need answers. What I needed was peace. And that peace came not when he left, but when I looked at myself with love and stopped waiting for someone to validate me. This mindset changes everything, because when you start to see your own worth, the ghosts lose their power. The memories still exist, but they no longer hurt. And even the looks from the past, the ones that once hurt us, begin to teach us. It's not about revenge, it's about liberation, about leaving the victim role and taking, with dignity, the role of protagonist in your own life. Comment: this makes sense to me. If you've ever looked back and realized that that silence, that look, or that absence ended up showing you who you really are, because sometimes the answer we seek comes from exactly where we least expect it. And when it arrives, everything changes. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there are pains that don't scream, but leave scars that last decades. And anyone who's been through it knows, it's not just about what happened. It's about everything that's been bottled up in the aftermath. The unanswered questions, the sleepless nights trying to understand where everything started to fall apart, the feeling of not being seen, heard, validated, and yet moving forward. I know there are many people listening to this now, reliving scenes that have never left their memory. A gesture, a phrase, an absence that still resonates. And that's why I need to say, with an open heart, you are not alone. This pain you carry is not madness. It's not exaggeration. It's not drama. It's the consequence of having trusted too much, loved too much, expected too much. And that doesn't make you weak. It shows how whole you were, even when the other offered you only halves. Life has these ironies. Sometimes we bleed in silence for years, and the world goes on as if nothing had happened. But inside us, there's a universe trying to reorganize itself. And what hurts most isn't always the event itself. It's the loneliness that comes afterward, the shame of sharing the story, the fear of being judged, the feeling of being too small to be noticed. And yet, it's in this silent space that strength is born. I say this with the voice of someone who has lived, who has fallen, who has been forgotten, but also with the voice of someone who rose again, not because they had help, but because they no longer wanted to live kneeling before a past that only hurt. Transformation begins the moment you look in the mirror and decide you will no longer hide from your own truth. It doesn't matter how long it took to get to this point. What matters is that you've arrived. The hidden truth behind these stories we rarely tell is that a new beginning never comes with a party. It comes in the silence of a dawn when tears dry on their own. It comes when no one applauds, no one asks, no one notices, but you keep going. And that's already a victory, because standing tall after being broken is one of the most beautiful forms of courage. I always say, you don't have to scream to be strong. Sometimes, strength is that simple act of getting out of bed when everything inside you just wants to disappear. It's making coffee. It's sticking to your routine. It's caring for others even when your heart's empty. And deep down, that's where rebuilding begins. Brick by brick, word by word, breath by breath. If I could look into the eyes of someone who's feeling this pain right now, I'd say, don't doubt your light. Even if they tried to extinguish it, even if they made you think you were weak, difficult, insufficient, don't believe it. Because those who try to extinguish someone else's light are precisely those who are afraid of seeing someone else light up where they once did. and you have everything you need to rekindle it. This is the journey of those who have been betrayed, forgotten, diminished, and yet still choose to move forward with dignity. Because there are things we only understand after the pain. Our mindset changes, our heart changes, our worldview changes. We stop begging for crumbs and start feeding on our own strength. And when that happens, even the ghosts of the past lose their power. Comment below. I'm on this journey too, if any part of this conversation touched your heart. Because sometimes, all we need is to know we're not going through this alone. And that, even though the story began with pain, it can end with courage, with truth, and, most importantly, with self-love. If you've stuck with me this far, it's because this story touched something deep inside you, and perhaps it awakened memories, healed a little, or even gave you the strength to carry on. If so, write in the comments, "This message was for me." I enjoy reading every word, because that's how this exchange makes sense, when we recognize ourselves in the other's experience. If you find this kind of content welcoming, inspiring, or simply supporting you through difficult times, subscribe to the channel. There's so much I still want to share with you, and perhaps, somewhere along the way, one of these stories could be yours too. Oh, and leave a like, okay? This not only helps this video reach those in need, but also strengthens this community we're building together, with truth, courage, and stories that truly touch us. There's a video here that complements this subject in a special way. Click and continue with me there, as the conversation isn't over yet.